Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to our laws, we lie. This is the epithet that marks the last stand of the 300 Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae. This is my favourite translation of the original Greek because it combines a wonderful rhythm with the saliency of what it meant to be a Spartan citizen. The epithet is attributed to Simonides of Chios from the 5th century, whose succinct speech made him the perfect non-Spartan for the job. But brief though he was, and unassuming as the epithet is, I can imagine that the famously blunt Spartans would have said something like, "Tell Sparta we kept the laws." Or even better, "We kept the law." Because for the Spartans, there was only one law. What was this law then, that the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae revered so much that they would live and die for it? After all, that act of self-sacrifice is what they and Sparta are most famous for. It strikes me then that understanding the Spartan constitution is the most important thing that one can do to understand Sparta and the Spartans themselves. And in this video, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to find out the story behind the real Sparta and the real 300 Spartans, the soldier elite that would inspire Frank Miller's comic book and the subsequent film and modern craze. We're going to look at the development of the fascinating and bizarre constitution that involved 2 kings, a citizens' assembly, and the infamous U4 oligarchs. We're going to discover how the Spartans viewed themselves, what kind of society would produce people devoted to war and nothing else, and thus we will ask whether the Sparta of legend matches the Sparta of reality. This is the story of the city-state of Sparta, immortalised by a mere 300 of its citizens 2,500 years ago. Just before we get to that though, I want to give a suitably laconic thank you to everybody that has so far supported the channel in any way. It's still very early days, and yet it has been incredibly motivating to see how people have enjoyed the videos. In fact, things have moved much faster than I would have predicted, and so by the time of recording this, the channel actually has 491 subscribers, not quite the 300 subscriber Spartan special. So I had to ask myself one thing.
What should a free man do?
Hence, I decided to stick 2 fingers up in the shape of the Spartan letter lambda to these mere numbers and go ahead with the video anyway. Finally, I've gotten around to setting up a Facebook page for the channel, so head on over and give us a like. Molon Larvae. Writing about Sparta, the 5th century BC Thucydides says that, "I suppose if Sparta were ever to be abandoned, and nothing but the temples and the foundations of the buildings remained, later eras would refuse to believe the city was as powerful as its reputation." I propose that everything that you need to know about Sparta can be summarised by this apparent paradox. The truth is that Sparta was a second-rate city that through sheer will, brutality and military prowess forced itself into the top tier and even preeminence of ancient Greece. Knowing where to begin with the history of Sparta is quite tricky because, in truth, historians are unsure exactly where it does begin. Myth, legend and proto-history weave and overlap, at times in agreement and at times in opposition. What sketchy or uncorroborated evidence is available has forced modern historians to create a most likely narrative of Sparta's history, whilst making room for the fact that we can't be, at least for the moment, entirely certain of exact things. In that vein then, this video can only give one perspective on the story of Sparta, but hopefully it is a useful one nonetheless. We're going to start by looking at the land of Sparta, both because it is instrumental to shaping the city and its people, and because whether you're looking at the myth or the history, the land is constant for both. Ancient Sparta existed in what is now modern Greece, called the Hellas by its inhabitants the Hellens. More specifically, it lay to the mid-southeast of the Peloponnesian Peninsula, the southernmost area of mainland Greece. The Peloponnese itself is very mountainous and large areas quite inhospitable for settlement. Sparta existed in the area known today as Laconia, and in particular in the Eurotas Valley, a fertile area perhaps no more than 4 or 5 miles across. To the right of Sparta, the eponymous river Eurotas, and to the left the Taygetus mountain range, with Mount Taygetus its crowning peak. Sparta has the good fortune therefore of coming to exist in one of the few good places for major settlement in the Peloponnese, being suitable for large-scale agriculture. On the other side of the Taygetus range was another large area of arable land called Messenia, and, as we shall shortly see, Messenia would come to define Sparta's entire existence. The Eurotas area has a long record of settlement, something that the Spartans themselves were aware of, at least mythologically. Let's start first with the mythological history that the Spartans themselves believed, since it is what actually motivated and conditioned them. According to the Spartans, one of the first settlers in the area was called Eurotas, and this king drained the valley of central Laconia and dug a ditch to the sea, the river Eurotas. Immediately then we see that Spartans tie themselves to a land that their ancestors literally remade in their own image and for their own purpose. Now Eurotas had no son, so he did what anyone would do, and he found a man called Lacedaemon to marry his daughter, called Sparta. This was a great match because Lacedaemon, of course, was tall, dark, and the son of the king of gods Zeus and a nymph called Taygete, the daughter of the titan Atlas who holds up the sky. Lacedaemon and Sparta would become the king and queen of the kingdom, and the kingdom and the capital city would be named after each respectively. Now later on Heracles, also known as Hercules in Latin, stops by Sparta, and for his own reasons he kills the incumbent king and he conquers Sparta. But being Hercules, he has no time for mere ruling, so he bequeaths the kingdom to a man called Tyndareus to rule in his stead. Meanwhile Hercules goes off and kills giant pigs, and mucks out the stable of eternally crapping cows. No, really, this is the story of the most famous soldiers on Earth. Still, it gets a lot weirder than that. Tyndareus married a princess called Leda. Now, Leda would find herself seduced, or raped, by Zeus, who happened to take the form of a swan. Naturally, Leda gave birth to an egg that contained one mortal child and one divine. The divine child was a girl who will be called Helen. Yes, the same Helen that's going to cause Troy a whole lot of trouble shortly. As a side note, an interesting bit of foresight occurs. Helen is actually first taken to Attica. This is the land surrounding Athens, and the Spartans have to go and get her back. They ravage the land of Attica, and this is exactly what will happen in the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens many centuries later. Well, of course, eventually Helen is taken to Troy, and the legendary war begins. The Trojan War has a big impact upon the Spartan psyche. The war begins with Sparta being wronged, and having the most beautiful thing in the world, and a piece of Sparta itself, taken from it. It is also for Sparta that all of Greece unites to crush an enemy and retake Helen in the process. Indeed, Troy is not simply defeated, but it is annihilated, and with the gods' blessing. Think of this as Sparta's just war theory. Sparta learns that its place in the world, and religion even, is central, and that it is a kind of leader. Now we'll come back to the mythology of Sparta later. How does this mythology so far compare to what historians and archaeologists have to say? Well, prior to our Spartans, the area of the Eurotas was inhabited by the Mycenaean Greeks of the Bronze Age. These are the Greeks who are said to take part in the Trojan War. It does appear that a city from the rough period was destroyed, so the myth is likely to represent a real war, perhaps over trade more than a stolen wife, but that's neither here nor there for us. The Trojan War occurs just before, and perhaps even a part of, an event that is still quite mysterious known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. At this point, the former powers and cultures of this era either collapse completely or are greatly diminished. So begins the so-called Greek Dark Age, an era when our ancient Greece would be born. As befits a Dark Age, information is sketchy. It appears that two villages are settled on the western bank of the Eurotas River, probably by the names of Pitana and Mezoa. These are not Mycenaean villages, however. Either at this point or shortly thereafter, they belong to a new ethnic group known as the Dorians, who it seems came down from the north into the Peloponnese, rather in the same way that Anglo-Saxons would migrate into formerly Roman Britain. Apparently these two villages were successful and they cooperated, because they spawned two more villages, and together these four villages form the foundations of our Sparta. Indeed, perhaps either from the leaders of the original two villages, or from joint rulers of each of pair of villages, does Sparta develop its tradition of having two kings. These were called the Agead and Eurypontid lines, and they were hereditary. Sparta thus is essentially founded with an unusual constitutional system that values a kind of partitioned central government, and this will develop much more extensively later. Now, the Greeks of the burgeoning Archaic era, as it is called, emerge with a new technology of iron and steel. Therefore, our early Spartans start their life with two vital resources for immediate expansion: reliable agriculture and reliable weaponry. You gotta eat, and you gotta hit people on the head with something that won't break. Sparta first spread north, subjugating settlements to its overlordship, before working its way south. This includes a bitter siege against their main rival Amyclae, and it is also the case that at this time, Sparta enslaves a settlement called Helos, slaves that would belong to the state and be allocated to work where it saw fit. This was another sign that Sparta had some unique proclivities to the other Greeks. Most subjugated peoples would simply become the Perioiki, though. These will be the free people of Lacedaemon, who recognised Sparta as overlord but kept to varying degrees local autonomy. Sparta thus comes to dominate its immediate area, but at this point it's run out of natural expansion. To the east and south is the wide open sea. To the north is the inhospitable Arcadian territory and the more powerful city-states like Argos, from which the UK still derives its name, and Corinth. These cities were becoming rich, and unlike Sparta, they had good access to trade, and they were not constrained therefore to the land for wealth and power. Finally, to the west, we have the Taygetus mountain range that was particularly hostile on the Spartan side. Landlocked and the land itself not ideal for easy trade, Sparta's early advantages fizzle out, and it found itself very naturally as a second-rate city. Powerful, but not top tier. Think of what a terrible fate for Sparta this must have been with its proud and enterprising history. It also meant that Sparta was somehow hemmed in and liable to developing in more isolation than other major Greek states. It isn't hard to see, for example, how later on Sparta will make a virtue of austerity, given its inability to trade easily. Nonetheless, it is at this point that the seeds of Sparta's future are planted. Sparta was ambitious, and it had proven its military ability, as well as establishing an agricultural over a commercial economy and society by necessity. In fact, alongside austerity, it's also easy to see why Sparta will make a virtue of military ability as the sole path to victory and prestige. And finally, geography encourages Sparta to become a quite parochial state. For all its high ambitions that other Greeks recognised, Sparta's mental horizons were limited by its geography, and a sort of covetedness for its own history. Still, no doubt it was training in this kind of geography that would give King Leonidas, commander of the forces at Thermopylae, the idea of stopping the much larger Persian force at a choke point. If the seeds of Sparta's future were sown during the initial period of expansion then, it was the war of annihilation that Sparta was about to fight with Messenia that would water them.